Hi, welcome back to Watch It Played. My name is Rodney Smith. If you've been following this series and you feel like you understand the rules so far, but you're not confident you'd remember them once you sat down and played, don't worry, I feel the same way. So what I did is I created this document. I call it the Dust Warfare Veteran Soldiers Reference Manual. I probably overstated calling it a manual. It's actually just one page, double-sided with small print. And the idea here is that if you're looking for a rules reminder or you're just not sure about the order of play, this document will most likely answer those questions. I also wanted to help you out a little more. I went back and I added an index to the video descriptions for each episode. So if you're looking for a particular gameplay element, it might help you find it a little more quickly. Finally, I just wanted to mention that we're not going to be covering all of the rules. At the end of this episode, we'll have covered, I'd say, about 95% of them, but I'm not going to go over each special weapon and each special ability. But when we do the gameplay episodes, you'll get some practical examples of some of them, which should help you out quite a bit. All right, so when we come back, what I want to go over is how you set up a scenario and the table so you can sit down and get ready to play. The rulebook provides you with scenarios you can play and create, but I want to tell you how to play the game tournament style. It's very similar to the custom scenarios that you can create in the book, but it's the method that I prefer when I sit down to play the game. If you want to find the information for how to play tournament style, you can go to the Fantasy Flight Games website. There's a PDF there, and I'll put a link to it in the YouTube description of this video. But to start, what players normally do is they decide on an army point total. They recommend between 200 and 400 points because that gives you a pretty meaty game. At the same time, doesn't make it too long. But if you want to lengthen your game, then, or shorter for that matter, you can adjust the army point totals accordingly. You also want to make sure you have enough terrain for the table. This provides both players with interesting tactical choices to make as they move across the battlefield. To make sure that you have enough, what they recommend doing is take all of the terrain that you plan on playing with and kind of pack it into one corner of the table. If it makes up a quarter of your total playing space, then you probably have enough terrain. Once both players arrive at the table, you also want to exchange an army list with your opponent, showing them what units you plan on bringing to the battle. That way both players can go over and make sure they understand exactly how the different units work, so there's no confusion about rules during the actual gameplay. So now it's time to actually build the scenario, and to do this, each player is given 2 scenario points. They then take 5 dice each, roll them, and the player with the lowest value gets to assign a point first, re-rolling for ties. And so I can assign that point to one of 3 things: objectives, deployment, or conditions. These are the 3 factors that we can have influence over when we're creating the scenario. So I might take my first point and assign it to deployment. Now my opponent can spend their first point. And they can assign it to deployment as well. Let's assume that they do. Then it comes back to me. I might put a point into objectives, and then my opponent might put a point into conditions. Now that the points are all spent, we need to see what they actually do. But keep in mind, you can never assign more than 3 points to any one of those factors. So let's take a look at deployment as an example. We can see that we could have assigned 0, 1, 2, or 3 points to this. And depending on how many points we assign, it's going to affect the deployment rules for the game we're about to play. As you can see, if we had put no points into deployment, then we would have been facing one another on the short ends of the table. Instead, we assigned 2 points, and that means we'll be facing one another across the long ends of the table, and initially placing our units within 9 inches of one of the table edges. That's what these red bands indicate. This is the deployment area. The objectives and conditions are determined the same way, and they've even put a table in the document that allows you at a glance to see what the results will be depending on how many points you put into each. Just as a further example, if we had put 0 points under conditions, that would mean we'd be playing in snowy weather, which would affect visibility. Or if we had put 2 points, that would mean playing with combat fatigue that would affect our troops. And now it's time to set up the terrain on the table. To start, each player will take 5 dice, give them a roll, re-rolling any ties, and the player with the least number of hits will then get to take any one piece of terrain and place it anywhere they want on the empty battlefield. Players will then alternate back and forth until all of the pieces have been placed. The only condition is you cannot place 2 pieces of terrain shorter than 4 inches apart, unless it becomes impossible not to do that, in which case just make sure you don't place them touching one another. Then it's time to deploy your forces to the setup battlefield. This is where you'll want to go back to the document and take a look at the picture there to see where the deployment zones are based on the number of scenario points that were spent for deployment. We spent 2 on our example, so we can see that players will be setting up within 9 inches of the long table edge. So I would take my measuring tape, measure 9 inches out, and then because I spent the first scenario point, I would get to place any one of my units onto the table first. And then we would alternate back and forth until all of the units had been placed on the battlefield. And that's it, you're ready to play. Normally in a tournament, the game would last 5 rounds. What I like to do is keep 5 tokens nearby, and at the end of each round I just remove one from the table so the players can both see very easily what round they're on. At the end of those 5 rounds, whichever player has most completed their objective will win the game. If you have any questions about Dust Warfare, please don't hesitate to ask them in the YouTube comments below. I'll be glad to answer them as quickly as I can and to the best of my ability. In the next episode, though, Luke and I will show you the armies that we have built and we will begin our actual gameplay. And don't forget, at the end of the episode, we're going to show you the battlefield from Luke's point of view and ask you to provide him with suggestions for what he should do during his turn, which he will then use during the actual game. Until then, though, thanks for watching.